So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lala Padija, the Director of the Psychiatry Residency Program Director and Chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, who will introduce today's speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is my privilege to introduce Dr. Kriegel, who's one of our wonderful PGY4 residents in the Adult Psychiatry Residency. He currently serves as the Chief Resident for the Outpatient Psychiatry Department. Before he came to us, he completed his undergraduate degree in cognitive neuroscience at the University of Pennsylvania. Later, he worked as a research assistant at the Boston University Chronic Traumatic Encephalopathy Center, which resulted in several publications. He later went on to complete his medical degree at Boston University, and then we had the fortune that he came to us. While he's been here, Josh has explored his interests and sought out supplemental opportunities. He focused his interest on psychotherapy and psychedelic-assisted treatment, co-founding the Psychedelic Science Interest Group at UMass. He also co-developed a protocol for the use of esketamine on inpatient psychiatry. As part of his elective, he became certified as a yoga instructor and co-leads a group therapy program that he developed combining gentle Qigong-like movements with CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. He also received his certificate in psychedelic-assisted therapy through the California Institute of Integral Studies. And he's been a wonderful resident and teacher, for which he received the Outstanding Medical Educator Award in 2021. Josh is inquisitive and thoughtful, and I'm sure you will see that in the next hour and get a sense of this in the presentation today titled The Human Encounter with the Denial of Death. Help me welcome Josh.
Thank you, Dr. Padilla. So as you mentioned, the title of my talk is The Human Encounter with the Denial of Death, and it's a combination of two book titles that were both written in the 1970s. The first, The Denial of Death, written by Ernest Becker, is an exploration of ideas in existential psychology and philosophy. And the second, The Human Encounter with Death, written by Stan Grof and Joan Halifax, is an exploration of the use of psychedelics in the treatment of cancer patients with existential distress. I'm told I need to include this slide. Okay, so I want to start today by speaking a little bit about the unlikely circumstances that led me to be speaking here with you today. So this is a picture of my maternal grandfather, Yechiel Wiener. I knew him as Grandpa Jack. Born in Krakow, Poland in 1919 in the shadow of World War I, the second of four children, Yechiel excelled at school. He spoke Yiddish and Polish at home, and at school he learned Hebrew, German, and Latin. He later easily picked up Russian, Romanian, French, and Italian. He attended medical school in Krakow. As one of the very few Jewish students, he was subjected to severe anti-Semitism. But despite being taunted frequently, he loved going to classes. When the Nazis invaded Poland, they entered the university on November 6, 1939, and they rounded up 184 professors for deportation to concentration camps. Even after learning about this, my grandfather went to class the next day, but the university was closed and would remain closed for the remainder of the war. In August 1942, his mother and two sisters were sent to Belzec, where they were all killed. My grandfather, who's on the far left, and his father were sent to a labor camp called Plaszów. Soon after arrival, his father was found to have money on him. He was shot on the spot by a Nazi. He was stripped and hung naked as a warning to other prisoners. Within 1 week, my grandfather had lost his mother, his sisters, and now his father. But this was just the start of the horrors that he faced during the war. He spent 2 years in Plaszów and then was sent to a death camp. And ultimately, in May 1945, he survived the death march from Chochwitz in Germany to Terezin in Czechoslovakia. Meanwhile, his brother Yitzhak, born just 3 months after him and my namesake, had left for Palestine in 1938 and was living there on a kibbutz. So after the war, my grandfather planned to travel through Italy to Palestine. And when he was rejected by the authorities, he wound up in a displaced persons camp in Landsberg, Germany, where he learned about an opportunity to resume his medical education at the University of Heidelberg, paid for by the UN Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. Okay, so we'll return to my grandfather's story in a little bit. So now I want to switch gears to the primary focus of this talk, which is about the treatment of existential distress in those facing terminal illness. First, we'll define demoralization syndrome. And then we'll turn to the work of Ernest Becker, trying to gain a deeper understanding of the true causes of demoralization syndrome. And from there, we'll revisit Grandpa Jack's story and then move to a discussion of Stan Grof's work as a pioneer in the use of psychedelic-assisted therapy for end-of-life distress. Demoralization is a common presentation of existential distress in patients facing end-of-life or progressive disease. It's recognized as a diagnostic entity in ICD-11, but not in DSM-5. And it's really been palliative care that's been at the forefront of recognizing the relationship between having a sense of purpose and having a will to live. Central to the concept of demoralization are symptoms of hopelessness and helplessness that are caused by a lack of purpose and meaning in life. And the spectrum spans from a mild loss of confidence or disheartenment to the beginning of losing hope and purpose, called despondency, and finally to a state in which all hope is lost, despair. This may ultimately lead to a desire for hastened death. Prevalence estimates range widely from 13 to 53% of patients with terminal or progressive illness. And there are no pharmacologic treatments for demoralization syndrome that have received regulatory approval for clinical use anywhere in the world. Demoralization can be contrasted with depression in that the core symptoms of depression include a loss of pleasure and interest in the present moment, whereas the core symptoms of demoralization are a loss of hope and meaning with a loss of anticipatory pleasure rather than a general anhedonia. And obviously these can co-occur, and they often do, but it's possible for an individual with demoralization syndrome, even to the point of suicidality, to not meet the criteria for a major depressive disorder. I want to talk a little bit about the origins of demoralization as articulated by Ernest Becker in his book, The Denial of Death, written in 1973. Perhaps ironically, the book was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in General Nonfiction in 1974, which was just 2 months after the author's death. Becker drew heavily on the work of Kierkegaard and Otto Rank, and he discussed Freud, Adler, James, Fromm, and many others. He starts by quoting William James. Mankind's common instinct for reality has always held the world to be essentially a theater for heroism. If you're a psychiatrist, Becker writes, and you want to understand directly what is driving your patient, ask yourself simply, how do they think of themselves as a hero? What constitutes the framework of reference for their heroic strivings? Or ask, why do they not feel heroic in their life? For James and for Becker, heroism forms the core problem of human life. Becker ties this in very closely with the concept of narcissism. Freud discovered that each of us repeats the tragedy of the mythical Greek Narcissus. We're hopelessly absorbed with ourselves. This selfishness seems to come from our animal nature, the need for the organism to protect its own integrity. If you took a blind and dumb organism, Becker writes, and you gave it self-consciousness, well, then you would have narcissism. A working level of narcissism is inseparable from self-esteem, a basic sense of self-worth. At its core, it's the desire to stand out as an object of primary value and cosmic significance. For Becker, the main self-analytic problem of life is to become conscious of what one is doing to earn those feelings of heroism. But human narcissism feeds not on food, but on symbols, on abstract ideas of self-worth. Where do we get these abstract ideas from? Well, our society provides them in the form of a codified hero system. Its structure of statuses and roles, customs and rules of behavior are designed to serve as a vehicle for earthly heroism. And we all serve society's hero system in order to feel that feeling of self-esteem that we matter, that our unique lives hold a primary value and purpose in creation. So the essence of humanity, according to Becker, is its paradoxical nature, that we are half animal and also half symbolic. We're both out of nature and yet hopelessly in it. And just as the animal aspect has a drive toward self-preservation, the symbolic aspect of humanity has a parallel and analogous drive toward heroism and self-esteem. Heroism is first and foremost a reflex of the terror of death. The fear of death must be behind all functioning if the organism is to be armed toward self-preservation. And naturally, we admire most the courage to face death. Historically, it was the hero. The hero was the individual who could go into the spirit world and the world of the dead and return alive. In his discussion of heroism, Becker cites Norman Brown and describes how Brown rebranded Freud's famous Oedipal complex as the Oedipal Project. And the essence of the Oedipal Project is to become the conqueror of death by becoming the father of oneself, to become the creator and sustainer of one's own life. And this, of course, is symbolized in Oedipus Rex by the marrying of one's own mother. By becoming one's own parent, an individual becomes like an immortal god, or what Spinoza calls the causa sui, the cause of oneself. In some groups and cultures, the Oedipal project was actually literalized as a quest for immortality, and this formed the essence of esoteric traditions throughout history, including Taoism, alchemy, and the Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece. In modern times, the quest for immortality is as robust as ever. And it's no coincidence that it's the tech millionaires at the forefront. Their Oedipal project starts out as the common cultural goal of starting a company and making lots of money. What is money if not a codified hero system that determines one's worth? But as they achieve success and billions of dollars, they find that they still sit on the toilet. They are still going to die. So they refocus their energies on the more literal Oedipal project. But despite billions of dollars being poured into immortality, we are bound to feel isolated, small, and impotent in the face of transcendent nature. Abraham Maslow described what he termed the Jonah syndrome, the evasion of the full intensity of life. In our most ecstatic moments, we say, "It's too much, I could die." We're just too weak for any large doses of greatness. The lack of strength to open oneself to the totality of experience leads to the second motive of humanity, the desire to merge oneself with the rest of nature, to lose oneself in something larger. This is the Christian motive of agape. As Otto Rank put it, we yearn for a feeling of kinship with the all. We want to be delivered from isolation and become part of a greater and higher whole. Rank called this the death instinct that pushes us to be part of something greater than ourselves, whether family, community, or all of humanity. And this stands in contrast to what Becker refers to as eros. This is Rank's life instinct, which pushes us to become self-sufficient individuals of cosmic significance. It's the urge for more life, for developing the uniqueness of the individual creature, the impulsion to stick out of nature and shine. Irving Yalom called this specialness, the striving to be so different, so unique, that the rule of all men are mortal will somehow not apply. Notice that the word eros is contained within the word heroism. So the human dilemma is that we obviously can't have both a merger in the power of another and the development of our own personal power at the same time, or at least not without some degree of ambivalence or self-deception. Because to yield to agape is to let one's guard down and admit to a dependency, a lack of self-sufficiency. It represents the abandonment of the hero project. But expanding eros too much risks cutting oneself off from duty to a larger creation, pulling away from the healing powers of gratitude and humility. Becker argues that we all want the impossible, to lose the isolation that comes with the hero project and yet to keep it at the same time. One way that we satisfy the need for these twin ontological motives is through the transference. We take the unspeakable and unknowable mystery of what the universe wants from us, and we make it more approachable by addressing our performance of heroics to another human being. The transference object becomes the locus of our conscience, of our cosmology of good and evil. And surrender to the other gives us a feeling of merging and provides heroic self-validation. They become what Yalom calls the ultimate rescuer, someone or something that's external which can rescue us from death. The ultimate rescuer permits us to feel forever watched and protected by an outside force. Captain Ahab says, "Let me look into a human eye. It is better than to gaze into sea or sky, better than to gaze upon God." The focus on an individual allows him to find the power and the horror all in one place instead of diffused through a mysterious, chaotic universe. The essence of the transference is that the patient transfers feelings they had toward their parents onto the physician. They become dependent on and draw power and protection from the doctor, who takes on the role of ultimate rescuer. We see the patient as a child at heart who distorts the world to relieve feelings of helplessness and anxiety. For Becker, the transference is a form of safe heroics, carried out in a partialized world. These ideas about partialization come from Otto Rank. Partialization is a narrowing down of the world. We all live in a small partialized universe in order to function normally. Because as soon as we start lifting our nose from the ground and sniffing at eternal problems like life and death, as I'm doing right now, then we start getting into trouble. And most of us spare ourselves this trouble by keeping our minds on the small problems of life, just as society maps them out for us. For Becker, the essence of normality is the refusal of reality, which is carried out through a partialization of the universe. So an athlete may be considered normal, even though they devote nearly all their waking hours to perfecting the art of hitting a ball into a hole. This is their partialized world, their locus of heroism. And it's also where we find an example of a socially accepted quest for immortality. So this is where the concept of neurosis comes in. For the neurotic, the techniques they've developed for cutting the world down to size begin to choke the person out. Becker describes neurosis as the miscarriage of clumsy lies about reality that we all unconsciously tell ourselves. Again, there's no clear line between normal and neurotic, since we all engage in these lies to partialize our worlds. Neurosis is something that we all share, but we call someone neurotic when the lies start to show damaging effects. The safe heroics poison the neurotic individual with the realization that it's so safe that it's not heroic at all. So in summary, neurosis is the result of safe heroics. Neurotic individuals feel they are not strong enough to face the terrors of the universe, which of course is the true state of affairs, but they react too totally. They fear going out in the street or up in elevators, or they might refuse transportation of any kind. It's as if they're saying, if I do anything at all, I will die. And it's easy to see how the fear of death leads to a fear of life. So in order to counteract these feelings of vulnerability, an individual may manifest symptoms that can function as their locus of heroism. For instance, in the case of OCD, someone may work out their need for invulnerability in the symptom of excessive hand washing. The symptom is an attempt to keep the world safe. The whole of their life's meaning is transformed into the simplified meaning that emanates from this self-created, partialized, neurotic world. Okay, so back to our hero's journey. We are represented here by this little blue button. And as we march to the right toward eros, toward individuation and uniqueness, our feelings of isolation grow. For Rank, this fear of separation and loneliness is called the fear of life. And it grows as we march toward individuation. But on the other hand, as we recede to the left toward the ideal of agape, toward a merging or a union with the other, then our feelings of unworthiness start to increase. For Rank, this is the fear of death, the fear of being a nobody or getting lost in the hole. So the combination of isolation or sticking outness relative to the ideal of agape and unworthiness relative to the ideal of eros leads to the feeling of natural guilt. And in the face of natural guilt, we must find a way of achieving size, importance, and durability. Basically, how can we be bigger and better than we really are? Humanity uses morality to overcome these feelings of natural guilt. We tell our kids that they're good after they had a nightmare to reassure them that nothing can hurt them. For Becker, morality is based entirely on our awareness of mortality, because humans see what's in store for themselves, whereas other animals don't. Morality is an antidote to the self-conscious awareness of our mortality. To be good is to be safe, to have special immunity from annihilation and death. Rank points out that it's no wonder that the age-old problem of good and evil has been associated with eligibility for immortality. So morality assures us that we have a special place of belongingness and perpetuation in the universe. Since we don't really know what the universe wants from us, morals give us a prescription for conduct, an explicit way of acting, in order to assure safety and to thereby avoid anxiety. And meaning is born as the moral action is carried out. According to Becker, we achieve morality through two primary methods. One, by conforming to the rules of power made by the transference objects, whether parents, teachers, the government, or the culture at large. And the second method is by developing a really valuable heroic gift, becoming extra special. So returning to this image of the hero's journey, we see how the first method of achieving morality, which is conforming to the transference object, moves our dot to the left, closer to the ideal of agape, further away from true individuation. So by conforming to others, our feelings of isolation are diminished. Developing a special gift moves the dot to the right, bringing us closer to the ideal of eros, of developing the uniqueness of the individual, thereby decreasing feelings of unworthiness. Okay, that was a lot. So now I want to shift the discussion back to my grandfather. If you recall, we're at the point in the story where he's in the DP camps, and he just learned of this opportunity to continue his medical education in Germany. And meanwhile, his brother, who's the only member of his immediate family who's still living, has been living on a kibbutz in Palestine throughout the war. Riddled with ambivalence about his situation, my grandfather poured his heart out to his brother through letters that were later uncovered by my family and translated in 2016 from a dense biblical Hebrew to English by my parents and members of their community. He writes to his brother, "Weren't the conditions that we lived in such that they could have taken out the human spirit from us and rinsed us of all morality? In spite of this, not for 1 minute did I stop being a human being. I stayed faithful to doing the right thing, true to the values that I learned in our home from our parents. Remarkably, my grandfather survived the horrors of concentration camps and death marches, and he was able to maintain a sense of goodness, of worthiness and belongingness through upholding his family values. But despite surviving the war with his morality intact, the sheer isolation and desperation of his situation must have left it in tenuous condition. Recall that the armor of morality is made of two primary ingredients. One, there's the conformity to the transference object, and two, the development of a special gift. And this is the essence of my grandfather's post-war dilemma. On one hand, he must remain good in the eyes of his brother by moving to Palestine to be with him. On the other hand, he must develop his individual hero project of becoming a doctor. His letters are the quintessential example of the ambivalence and guilt that arise from the twin motives of man, eros and agape. Don't weep, my brother. What happened to all Polish Jews happened to our family. Our father is lying in the Jewish cemetery in Krakow. Now I have only you, my dear brother. I want us to be together. We must begin a new life. We must build a new hope." This was written in 1945, shortly after his liberation. If I want to go to the depths of my thinking, I come to the conclusion that I want to be prominent in my field, to advance and make a name for myself. Here he speaks to the powerful force of his heroic drive. "I shouldn't, God forbid, put myself onto your shoulders. Allow me to build my future with my own independent power." Here we see the yearning toward independence and individuation. "I hope you won't judge me harshly. My brother, what do you say about this? What sentence will you decree on me? How will you judge me? Will you understand me?" Here we see tremendous guilt about how his brother might judge him for staying in Germany, of all places, to pursue a career in medicine. His brother's judgment takes on an almost godlike quality. "It is a big sacrifice that I will be far from you for a number of years, but worse than this would be if after I came and I'd be happy to be with you, I would then be disappointed with my work and my life circumstances." His drive toward individuation creates precisely the isolation that he cannot stand, and yet needs in order to develop distinctively. My grandfather wisely knew that however sweet it would be to see his brother, there were no medical schools in Palestine at the time, and if he were to sacrifice his own heroic quest to become a doctor in an effort to be with his brother, this would only lead to more disappointment and guilt. Viktor Frankl wrote that a man who becomes conscious of the responsibilities he bears toward a human being who affectionately waits for him, or to an unfinished work, will never be able to throw his life away. I can't help but note the remarkable similarities between my grandfather's story and Frankl's. My grandfather's drive to become a physician and to reunite with his family gave his life purpose during and after the war, just as Frankl's desire to reunite with his wife and to complete his manuscript on logotherapy helped him to survive the war and to rebuild afterward. They are both testament to the resiliency of the human spirit. So now I want to tie this all back to the concept of demoralization. In demoralization syndrome, which is aptly named, one has lost their morals, their armor against feelings of badness. If morality is the overcoming of smallness, then demoralization is the succumbing to this smallness, to these feelings of natural guilt, which are comprised of unworthiness and isolation. And without morals, life begins to lose its meaning. The individual's hero project is revealed as merely a pretense that one is invulnerable because he's protected by the power of others or the power of culture. And so recall for Becker that to become conscious of what one is doing to earn a feeling of heroism is the main self-analytic problem of life. We can say that the terminal diagnosis has brought clarity about the failure of the hero project. Their partialized world is being invaded by the terror of death and the threat of meaninglessness. And with this comes a resignation from life. So with the threat of death looming large, the individual must scramble to find a sense of enduring value in other places. So much of Becker's work has to do with making one's immortality ideologies explicit. So if we're thinking about treatment for a demoralization, we would expect just this: a deconstructing of previous morals and reconstructing of new, more explicit morality. It would allow an individual to see through the safe heroics that they use during life. And this treatment would also instill a new sense of goodness and could perhaps reconcile the seemingly paradoxical motives of agape and eros. We are describing nothing short of a psychological death and rebirth. In the human encounter with death, Stan Grof and Joan Halifax discussed their work with psychedelic-assisted therapy in individuals with terminal illness. Grof, who's now in his 90s, is a Czech-born psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who moved to the US in 1967 to conduct research at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center. He's conducted thousands of psychedelic sessions and is widely recognized as one of the key pioneers in the field. By 1974, Grof and his team had enrolled more than 100 patients in the program. In order to qualify, patients had to have some degree of physical pain, depression, anxiety, or psychological isolation associated with the patient's malignancy, and a life expectancy of at least 3 months. Exclusion criteria were major cardiovascular problems, brain hemorrhage, brain metastases, psychosis, and epilepsy. The protocol for the Spring Grove program involved 3 phases: the preparation, the psychedelic-assisted session, and the integration. In the prep period, the therapist focused on establishing rapport and trust, discussing issues with accepting diagnosis, prognosis, and death. And the therapist met with family members both with and without the dying person. Psychedelics were presented as non-specific amplifiers or catalysts that make it possible for a person to explore otherwise inaccessible areas of consciousness. They use metaphors such as describing it as a waking dream or as a vivid intrapsychic movie. The drug session was conducted by a male-female therapy dyad using either LSD or dipropyltryptamine, which is DPT, a similar faster-acting psychedelic compound. And during the session, the patients were asked to remain in reclined position with eyes covered by eye shades, listening to music. They were encouraged to face everything that emerged, to experience it fully with total psychological surrender to the experience. All antipsychotics were discontinued 1 week prior, but there was no interruption of narcotics, antibiotics, chemotherapy, or hormonal medications. During the session, the therapist provided nonverbal support where possible, and this included physical contact such as holding hands, rocking, or even in some cases, cradling. They postponed any discussion of the session until the evening or the following day. In the latter hours of the session, they used family photographs to elicit emotions and memories. And they also invited family members or good friends into the treatment room as the patient was returning to a usual state of consciousness, which often facilitated more open and honest communication. If the outcome of the session was successful, then no additional sessions were scheduled. But if the result was not satisfactory, or if the condition worsened as the disease progressed, then the session was repeated. And also an interesting note is they actually did some of these sessions in the patient's home, which they said was a much deeper and more personal experience for everyone involved. So before diving into a few patient anecdotes, I want to briefly touch on Grof's theoretical models. So here we see his depiction of different levels one might encounter during a psychedelic experience. At the most surface level, people may encounter aesthetic experiences such as fractal patterns or enhancement of appreciation for music and art, but these do not convey psychological insights or reveal deep levels of an individual's unconscious. LSD sessions in which aesthetic experiences played an important part tended to not lead to profound psychological changes. At the next level, people will enter the psychodynamic realm, which often features what Grof called a system of condensed experience, or COEX. This is a constellation of specific memories that have a similar basic theme with a common emotional charge. So for instance, all the times that someone was made to feel shame throughout their life. Next is the level of the perinatal matrices, which is a concept that Grof is perhaps most famous for. And finally, the transpersonal realm, which is beyond ego, time, and space. These levels don't necessarily proceed in order, and a person who's never done a psychedelic may jump right into the transpersonal realm. But oftentimes it does proceed sequentially from the aesthetic through the psychodynamic into the perinatal and then the transpersonal. Grof delineates 4 basic perinatal matrices, or BPMs. He argues that individuals may experience literal memories of their birth, but primarily these are ways of categorizing and understanding the archetypal images and experiences that arise naturally in the deepest layers of our personal unconscious. BPM 1 seems to be related to the primal union with the mother, with archetypal images of heaven and mystical union, strong positive affect of tranquility and bliss, and transcendence of time and space. BPM 2 signifies the onset of delivery, the disturbance of that blissful unity, and the expulsion from paradise into a world of duality. The source of danger cannot clearly be identified, and it's associated with overwhelming feelings of paranoia. Individuals may experience evil influences coming from members of secret organizations, inhabitants of other planets, or evil sorcerers. One variation is that of being swallowed and incorporated by a terrifying monster, like the biblical story of Jonah. Images may arise of collective events like Nazi concentration camps or gas chambers. And individuals feel trapped in a claustrophobic world with archetypal images of hell arising from various cultural frameworks. The situation is experienced as inescapable and eternal. In BPM 3, the fetus is propelled through the birth canal. This is experienced as massive struggle for survival, often involving contact with biological material. Archetypal images of apocalyptic war scenes and raging elements of nature may arrive as enormous amounts of aggressive energy are discharged and consumed in experiences which may involve torture of all kinds. This is often followed by an experience of passing through a purifying fire. Suffering and agony culminate in an experience of total annihilation on all levels: physical, emotional, intellectual, moral, and transcendental. This is typically referred to as ego death, a destruction of all the previous reference points of the individual. The universe is perceived as indescribably beautiful. Individuals feel cleansed and speak about redemption or union with God. Christopher Bosch, an academic philosopher who engaged in 73 high-dose LSD sessions, described the consistent features of the psychedelic death experience: complete surrender to whatever one is confronting, a loss of control, and disorientation so deep that it dissolves reality as we have known it. Similarly, the essence of rebirth is consistent: the experience of awakening inside a new and unanticipated dimension of existence, the birth of a new identity with new capacities, and the experience of absolute grace, of having been given infinitely more than one has given up. Grof argues that there are clear parallels between these perinatal matrices of LSD sessions and rites of passage. A rite of passage marks a change in a person's social status. These are ceremonies surrounding events like childbirth, puberty, and marriage and death. The German ethnographer Arnold van Gennep described 3 consecutive stages that are common in all rites of passage throughout the anthropological literature. They are separation, transition, and incorporation. First, the initiate is separated from their social network. Then, through techniques ranging from fasting and sleep deprivation to psychedelics, the initiate learns the core notion in all rites of passage, which is that one can suffer through the chaos of dying and emerge renewed and reborn. Lastly, the initiate is incorporated back into the community with new conceptual frameworks and worldviews, or in essence, a new set of morals. Grof also points out that in many indigenous rites of passage, the initiation hut is often called vagina or womb. He notes that the use of fecal material or blood of sacrificed animals are incorporated into some rituals, which approximate the situation of the neonate in the birth canal. Torture, suffering, and struggle for survival are common in many rites of passage, as in the psychedelic experience. And the abrupt transition from extreme torture into transcendental bliss is one of the most common occurrences, both in psychedelics and in rites of passage. Here you can see how Grof's BPMs map onto Gennep's stages. There's the tranquility of life, or the status quo, before the rite of passage, which maps to the cosmic unity of BPM 1. Then there's the isolation and paranoia that come with being separated from the tribe and disturbance of the intrauterine equilibrium. Then in the death, rebirth struggle and transition phases, there's torture and danger. And lastly, there's the rebirth experience and the incorporation back into the tribe with an entirely new outlook and new understanding of one's role. These rites of passage throughout the life cycle emphasize that it is possible to undergo an experience of complete annihilation and emerge reborn. This can be seen as preparation or practice for biologic death. So now we can begin to understand Socrates when he said that philosophy is preparation for death, or Seneca, who wrote that it takes an entire lifetime to learn how to die. And then there's the more esoteric notion that the man who dies before he dies does not die when he dies. Grof attributed this quote to Abraham a Sancta Clara, a 17th century Augustinian monk, but it's also inscribed above the door of St. Paul's Monastery in northern Greece circa 10th century CE. And in Brian Murarescu's Immortality Key, he makes a convincing argument that the Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece dating to 1500 BCE were centered on this idea. The most common description given by initiates into those mystery schools was that they underwent an experience involving metaphorical death and rebirth. Murarescu employs archaeochemistry research that suggests that the kykeon of the Eleusinian mysteries was an ergotized beer, basically a psychedelic brew similar to LSD. And some notable participants in these rituals included Plato and Marcus Aurelius. Okay. Now recall that for Becker, our animal instincts of self-preservation and our symbolic drive toward heroism and self-esteem are driven by a fear of death. Death anxiety is the motor that drives the quest for self-esteem, which includes aiming to please the transference object and developing a unique skill or gift. So from this knowledge, we can expect that as the fear of death diminishes, these gears will start to grind to a halt. So in essence, Grof views the psychedelic experience as a form of exposure therapy for death. He notes that this experience is usually so realistic that it's perceived as experientially identical with actual biological demise. And this conclusion is based on individuals who have both had a psychedelic ego death and a true near-death experience. The psychedelic experience is used as a model for their actual encounter with death. They discover the importance of surrendering, because just as with rites of passage, ego death is always followed by feelings of rebirth, and any resistance against this natural unfolding necessarily means prolonging the suffering. Grof states that whatever ontological significance may be ascribed to these experiences is really irrelevant, because the visions experienced in psychedelic sessions appear very real to individuals, and they're often reported to feel even more real than real. But ultimately what matters, at least in a medical context, is that these experiences make their otherwise dismal situations much more tolerable. Now I'd like to transition to some phenomenological accounts from Grof sessions, as I think much can be gleaned from hearing these individuals' experiences. And often our discussion of psychedelics focuses on clinical trials and statistics, and though these data are informative and important, they do not and cannot possibly tell the full story. Ted was a 26-year-old African-American male suffering from inoperable colon cancer. He was contacted in late 1971 as a potential candidate for the DPT study. At the time, he was severely depressed, irritable, anxious, and had considerable difficulties in his marriage. Ted was initially assigned to the control group, but then he had the option of having the psychedelic therapy outside the framework of the study. Grof reports that in Ted's first session, he saw soldiers dying in wars, adults and children perishing in epidemics, and various people killed in accidents. But somehow he could see beyond death. Nobody involved in these situations really died. It was merely a transition to a different kind of existence. Nothing got destroyed. Everything was an internal flux and transformation. In one session, Ted became convinced that he had died, and God appeared to him as a brilliant source of light, telling him not to fear, assuring him that everything would be all right. He had visions of crystals, diamonds, ornate goblets and chalices in beautiful colors and supernatural radiance, as he felt an upsurge of loving feelings toward his wife and children, as well as his therapists. Shortly after his third LSD session, Ted developed uremia caused by an obstruction. He was taken to the OR where he had 2 cardiac arrests and was resuscitated on both occasions. Ted emphasized how glad he was that he had the 3 LSD sessions. He found the experience of actual dying similar to his psychedelic sessions and considered the latter excellent training and preparation. Quote, "Without the sessions, I would have been scared by what was happening, but knowing these states, I was not afraid at all." Suzanne was a 32-year-old woman who was diagnosed with an advanced gynecological cancer that had spread throughout her pelvis despite radical hysterectomy and course of intensive radiation. The neoplastic process had invaded the nerve plexuses along her spine, causing excruciating pain. At the time of her presentation, she was struggling with her surgeon's suggestion of a chordotomy. On one hand, she wanted alleviation of her pain, but she was unable to face the risks of paralysis of legs and incontinence. So she became deeply depressed to the point of considering suicide. She'd lost all interest and initiative in everything. In her first session, Suzanne describes her efforts to fight her way through a large triangular mass of shiny black material that looked like a mountain of anthracite coal with ragged edges. She was biting and chewing her way through. When she finally made it through, the experience opened into a world of millions of colors and eventually into images of swirling galaxies. Later, Suzanne identified the black mountain from which she was liberated as a symbol of death. Grof reports that as a result of this first session, her depression disappeared, her fears were alleviated, and she felt an upsurge of energy and initiative. Her pain, however, continued to be excruciating, and so a second session was scheduled. In her second session, she had a sequence of experiences that felt like past lifetimes. Suzanne became an African native running with her fellow tribespeople on plains scorched by the sun. At the end of this episode, she was killed by a spear that hit her in the back and penetrated deep inside. She lost consciousness and died. Later in the session, she became a bird soaring through the skies and was shot by an arrow, falling to the earth with a broken wing. Then she became a tiny speck in space in an infinite universe filled with beautiful stars. After her second psychedelic session, she gained more clarity about the chordotomy. "I don't care if I'm crippled from my neck down and pee all over Baltimore," she said. "I want my consciousness clear and not absorbed by this pain." But more striking was the change in Suzanne's concept of death. Instead of seeing death as absolute blackness and nothingness, as she did originally, She started thinking in terms of cycles and transitions. We'll return to Suzanne's story in a little bit. So in each of these cases, we can see how the psychedelic experience has diminished the fear of death. And as the fear of death decreases, the quest for self-esteem no longer seems to carry that same urgency and is seen in a new light. Recall that for Becker, the main self-analytic problem of life is to become conscious of the ways in which one earns a feeling of heroism. So with reduced fear, participants can now safely deconstruct their prior morals, and they begin to see more clearly the ways in which they earn their self-esteem throughout their life, whether through appeasing others or perhaps in the pursuit of a special gift that might give them money, fame, or power. Joan was a 40-year-old housewife and mother of 4 when she was diagnosed with terminal GI cancer. She received 300 micrograms of LSD intramuscularly due to gastrectomy and concerns about absorption. 20 minutes into the session, as she listened to Brahms' second piano concerto, she had visions of standing in the gigantic hall of a futuristic supersonic airport waiting for her flight. The hall was crowded with passengers clad in extremely modern fashion. She heard a loud voice through a system of airport speakers. The event you are going to experience is yourself. With some of you, as you may notice, it is already happening. Then, as she looked around, she saw strange changes in the fellow travelers' faces, their bodies twitching, assuming unusual postures. And then the image of Joan's father appeared with great clarity, and the nature of their relationship was analyzed and explored with the precision of a surgical operation. Joan perceived his need for her to be something or someone that she could not be. She realized that she had to be herself, even if it disappoints him. She became aware of a whole network of other people's needs, her husband's, children's, friends. She realized that the needs of other people made it difficult for her to accept the reality of her impending death and to surrender to the process. I just cannot be all those things to all those people. I have to be myself, Joan said. After her 3rd session, she remarked, I described to my father how much energy I expended pretending to be glad or happy or to smile. I talked about the beauty in sadness, sad sweetness, sweet sadness, allowing yourself and others to be sad when they feel it. Sadness perhaps is not in vogue, as is joy, spontaneity, or fun. These I expended great energy in acting out. All the pressures to be something other have been taken off of me. I feel relieved from sham and pretense. Much spiritual feeling permeates my everyday life. Joan was able to deconstruct the ways in which she conformed to others throughout her life, the first method of achieving morality. And with regard to the second method of achieving a sense of goodness, of developing a unique heroic gift, Grof writes that psychological acceptance of death results in the realization of the absurdity and futility of exaggerated ambitions, attachment to money, status, fame, and power. A person who has gone through psychological death and rebirth realizes that a positive feeling about life and deep sense of meaning of one's own existence are not contingent on external conditions. They represent a primary organismic state and a way of being in the world that's independent of the material circumstances of life. Back to our hypothesis. So now we've seen how morals are deconstructed in the psychological death. Let's examine the psychological rebirth, which leads to a reconstruction of morals. If you recall, Suzanne is the one who experienced the sequences of death, first as experienced by an African tribesman and later as a bird. Grof goes on to describe how she oscillated between feelings of being trapped and desperate attempts to escape and free herself, between the tortures of metaphysical loneliness and striving for reunion. She felt a deep identification with all the mothers who have ever given birth and all the children who have ever been born. Then she subjectively became all of them. She became connected with all the suffering of humanity, millions and millions of people crying in pain. She was crying with them, and at the same time, she was them. All these sequences converged in a powerful synthesizing image. She became the mother of all men who've ever been killed in the wars throughout human history. And as she became all these mothers and all these children, she felt that she was growing inside of herself, trying to give birth to herself. She was hypersalivating and experiencing the water in her mouth as amniotic fluid. In a final sequence of being born and dying, her adult ego died while a new baby self was born. In the following days, she radiated energy and determination. She was able to continue her life without thinking about her cancer, taking one day at a time, focusing on the problems of each day as it unfolded. That is actually, this is a quote, that is actually what we all should do, whether we are healthy or sick. None of us knows the day and the hour when death will come. Note how before she experienced her rebirth, she oscillated between the loneliness that comes with the hero project and the striving for reunion, as if the twin motives of agape and eros are playing tug of war with her. Ronk might say that her life instinct is pulling her toward metaphysical loneliness, and her death instinct is pulling her toward reunion. And then, in this journey deep into her mind, Suzanne experiences herself as a mother of herself. Does this sound familiar? Recall the Oedipal project, the striving for the ultimate heroism to become completely independent, self-sufficient, to become the father of oneself, or in this case, the mother of oneself. Interestingly, on her psychedelic journey, Suzanne actually experiences herself as the causa sui, the cause of herself. On her journey to get to that point, she became all the mothers who've ever given birth and all the children who've ever been born. So this is ostensibly the complete opposite of eros, of individuation, of earning a place of unique cosmic significance. It's only through the surrender to becoming part of the greater whole of humanity that she earns this highest ideal of heroism, that of the godlike causa sui. The seemingly oppositional motives of agape and eros are reconciled. So perhaps this is a more accurate diagram. Becker's twin motives of man only seem to be irreconcilable, but what the psychedelic experience teaches is that surrender to the greater whole, in Suzanne's case, experiencing herself as the mother and child of all of humanity, surprisingly leads to the very feelings of cosmic heroism we've been searching for. Life leads to death, and remarkably vice versa. This circle connecting agape and eros is reflective of death rebirth cycles that are experienced in the unconscious realm and which are pervasive throughout mythology and rites of passage in all corners of the world throughout history. My grandfather was diagnosed with stage 4 prostate cancer 5 weeks before his daughter's wedding. He was in his late 60s. In my aunt's eulogy, she remarks that he never stopped to say, "Why me?" And instead he said a prayer called Chehechianu, thanking God that he had been given the privilege of reaching this milestone of living to see his last daughter married. Here he is at my aunt's wedding. My grandfather could not have been more explicit about the sources of his self-esteem and his feelings of heroism. He made a willful and conscious, though agonizing decision at a young age, after facing death in the most horrific ways imaginable, of how he would build a new life. He earned his worth through his family and through his career as a pediatrician, running a small practice out of an office attached to his home. On his gravestone is inscribed the following words: "The knowledge of the physician makes him hold his head high, and in the presence of great men he shall be held in admiration." So there are many people I'd like to thank. First, I'd like to recognize my family and my ancestors. And yes, that's a picture of me with Grandpa Jack. My co-residents who've been incredibly supportive and tolerant of my philosophical musings. And the program directors who have been so encouraging of me pursuing my interests and passions throughout residency. And to the numerous mentors I've had along the way too many to name individually. And special thank you to Jonathan Carroll, who wrote his PhD on the topic of death denial and psychosis and offered me valuable commentary on my presentation. And so I'm thrilled to have Dr. Sunita Puri here. Dr. Puri is one of our palliative care physicians and author of That Good Night, Life and Medicine in the 11th Hour. And so she graciously agreed to share some brief reflections before opening it up to the audience for a Q&A.
I have a soft voice, and with the duck bill on, even with the microphone, you won't be able to hear me. So I'm going to remove it for now. I just want to really deeply commend Dr. Kriegel for an amazing presentation that interweaved the very human stories and the human struggles that ultimately lead many people down the path of psychedelics. And I am from California, so for me, stereotypically, I come from a place where psychedelics have kind of been talked about for a very long time in the field of palliative care and even in the field of psychiatry. And I think our specialties share something very unique in that we have a unique inroads into what suffering and dignity and living well with a serious illness, whether it be schizophrenia or end-stage cancer, we really share that path together. And so I really just wanted to say to all of you that I think palliative care and psychiatry can be very closely allied in considerations of how we use psychedelics, because really what we both do is help people to have that journey back to themselves. Like I think Joan had said, I forget the exact quote, but it was very profound. And so even though it's kind of a new and developing avenue of healing, it's one that I really hope that we can all learn more about, because I, in my own practice, have seen how nothing I do and nothing families do can ultimately help people in some situations as much as a psychedelic journey can do. So thank you so much, Dr. Kriegel, for letting me be here and letting me take a look at your presentation, which needed really nothing from me. But I'm really happy to be here, and I think we want to open it up to questions.
Thank you so much.
So we have some questions online and we have some questions in the room. So we'll go with the room first.
Well, Josh, thank you so much. This has been a great presentation, and I think you have material for a very good psychophilosophical yet personal essay to be written there. There's a lot of very relevant points, especially in introducing psychedelics to this question of, death exercises, what we do. I mean, people have thought about, how to exercise death since the beginning of man. This is not really new. I mean, the Stoics talked about it, the pre-Socratics, the Greek philosophers did that. So, and your story has also a lot of good personal elements that, and your experience in psychedelics. So what I wanted to say is that if you want to write this, I'm raising my hand to at least take a look. I'll be at your disposal. I don't have a question, but I have a couple of very brief reflections. I'm happy to hear that we have another exercise for death. We really need some exercises for ourselves to talk with people about. And we've always talked about meditation as an exercise for death. People has always talked about that. The strive towards nothingness in thought and mind. Sleep as an exercise for death. And that's why it's very important. And I always talk to people about this, whether patients or residents. If we can do one thing for our patients, and only one thing, we can work with them on working on their sleep, because that is relinquishing control. A lot of people can't sleep because they can't really let go. Now I see psychedelics as a new good tool. It seemed like as a new exercise for death, and this has I have not thought about it before. The second reflection that I wanted to say is, other than death denial, or the other side of the coin is death wish, which we hear a lot of people talk about. And I have a lot of patients that when I first started in residency, I was very terrified to hear them talk about death. I didn't know what to do. Should I just, involuntarily, commit everybody who talks about death and say, I wish I die? And then with training and experience and life, and I'm not saying that, I've only been out of training a few years, but you start to see how thinking about death sometimes can be helpful. I mean, the Stoics talked about the open door. I mean, we always have an open door. We can always walk out of life. This is part of being a human. There are very rare examples of animals committing suicide, but obviously we are the only species that commit suicide. And there is a place not to shy away from this, and actually just to look at it face to face, look at death face to face, and entertain that open door, which I think through the cycle can bring us back to looking into our life. So we should not really shy away from the open door, but talk openly with people, with ourselves about it. Okay, we want you wish you die, but, let's talk about that more, rather than just say, well, no, let's see what you have in your life, because a lot of people, even fantastically, use that as a coping mechanism. I mean, if your pain is unbearable, it's something you cannot really tolerate. I think it's only human and only natural to think of the open door that you certainly can walk out of, or you can be, you can later on die on your own and somebody will drag you out of it. But, it's certainly a kind of the mirror image of this phenomena of death anxiety is death wish. And I don't know if this stimulates anything or whether it fits in what you're writing and what you're thinking about, but I just wanted to share that with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I mean, I think we as psychiatrists need to be experts on death in some respects, because we deal with it all the time. And when somebody has a death wish, what is that wish really all about? I think we need to first, cope with these things and face them ourselves before we can start helping others with them.
So you mentioned Dr. Carroll in your talk, and Dr. Carroll has a comment and a question. He said, "Thank you for a fantastic talk about a critical topic, death anxiety, that is rarely given space in our field. Grof's use of psychedelics as, quote, exposure, unquote, appear to rely on the patient's actual nearness of death from their terminal illness as a prime to guide the experience toward the theme of rebirth and rediscovery of meaning/purpose. Would psychedelics help, or could they play a role with people in everyday therapy who are not explicitly near death to orient towards this fundamental issue to, quote, reinvent, unquote, their current lives and make the most of their limited time in our finite lives? Do we have to wait until we are near death to learn to cope with the ticking clock?"
I mean, I think that in some ways, the whole point of this presentation is no. And to just like go back, well, maybe it's too many slides to go back, but Grof's model of the the aesthetic and then the psychodynamic and then the perinatal applies to anyone, whether they're facing death or not, because really we're all facing death. And so the death experience is something that is universal in the psychedelic experience. What I think it probably comes up more for people who are directly facing death, but I certainly think it's universal.
Thank you for the wonderful talk, Josh. Sorry, this is the kind of pragmatic pessimist in me coming out, but the experience, this idea of experiencing death during a psychedelic trip sounds like something that could be very traumatic. And I'm thinking of PTSD, people who've gone to war, seen death, and then end up developing PTSD. Is that a possibility with a psychedelic trip?
Definitely. We've all heard of the bad trip. And that's why having the trust in the therapist and the process is so important, because as these things come up, the more that one resists, the worse the experience might be. And as I think Grof points out, the death experience is always followed by a rebirth experience. But if you can't get there because there's too much resistance, then it can certainly be traumatic. And those are risks in the field that we all need to research more and think about ways of mitigating.
Could you grab a mic?
Oh, am I not loud enough?
Oh,
For the people online.
So, so much of, being a guide is making sure that the person's mindset and the setting are ideal. And when people have serious psychiatric histories, that's definitely something an experienced guide or therapist will talk at length about over many sessions before even getting to the use of the substance, whatever that might be. So can people have bad trips? Absolutely. But if that happens, then at least it's the sort of thing that as much risk mitigation as possible has happened before we actually take them through the process. And you really need a guide who's gone through extensive training to be able to kind of be there and support someone through it and talk someone through it during the journey, but then afterwards as well.
So it's getting late. This is great, but I also wanted to just announce that we are going to be doing a study of the psychedelic psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression starting sometime in this spring. And we are looking for people who are interested in being trained to be the therapists to participate in the study. So if you're interested, send me an email, please. Thank you very much. This was very interesting.